access, please dial in using the number that's in the chat box right now. The access code and telephone number were submitted moments ago. You can send us questions at any time for the speaker during this webinar. Simply type them in the question box off to the right, and we will answer all questions at the end of the presentation. Please note, an audio version and the slides from today's webinar will be available on the National Council website at www.thenationalcouncil.org within the next 48 hours. If at any point during the webinar you experience technical difficulties, please call Citrix Tech Support at 888-259-8414. Again, 888-259-8414. And with that, I'd like to introduce our presenter today, Michael GLOMB of Feldman Tucker Leaper & Fiddle. Michael, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. I want to move the slide up one, please. Michael? Okay. So welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, maybe. As I said, my name is Mike GLOMB. I'm a partner here at Feldman Tucker Leaper & Fiddle in Washington, D.C. I have a background in healthcare corporate compliance, general corporate issues, which is why I'm doing this webinar. And I also have the privilege of teaching a couple courses at the George Washington University School of Public Health and Health Services. I won't say the over 3 decades of experience. It ages me a bit. Next slide, please. The typical lawyer disclaimers. This information is prepared by us solely for information purposes. Any opinions expressed here are solely ours or mine in particular, and are not necessarily the views of the National Council. And also, we're doing this webinar with the understanding that we're not engaged here in rendering specific legal or professional legal services. If you have specific questions or specific issues to be addressed, you're definitely advised to contact local counsel or other competent professional who can advise you. Next slide, please. So the agenda for this afternoon, briefly, is to, although the reason for the webinar is the change in the rules that become effective in December. I want to go through the basic overtime requirements in general. Number one, because I found that clients who are grappling with these rules sometimes aren't applying the rules appropriately, even under the existing rules. And secondly, because the income threshold, the wage compensation threshold will increase significantly in December, you are likely to have a lot more people in your organization who are eligible for overtime than you had before, so it's important to understand what the requirements are. And then also the key exemptions to the federal overtime requirements. Importantly, the new definition of salary basis, which is the threshold increase that we're talking about in this webinar. And then some thoughts that I have, although they may not be exclusive, about ways organizations can cope with the new threshold under the regulations. Advance the slide, please. Okay, so basic FLSA requirements. Minimum wage, which is really not an issue here, it's currently $7.25 at the federal level. The requirement under FLSA for overtime is that employers pay 1.5 times, 1.5 times the regular rate of pay for more than 40 hours worked in a work week. It's important to note that these requirements are the federal minimum rules. Many states and localities have more stringent FLSA rules, typically higher minimum wages, but sometimes requirements to pay overtime for fewer than 40 hours worked in a week. And if you are in one of those jurisdictions, you would be subject to those rules because the FLSA essentially defers to whatever set of rules, benefits are more advantageous to the employee. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there we're cooking here. Okay, so the key terms from the previous slide. When you're computing overtime pay, you need to know what the regular rate of pay is for the work week involved. And that, under the rules, the FLSA regulations, includes all remuneration for employment except overtime, weekend and holiday differentials, discretionary bonuses, etc. So you don't have to factor in the weekend and holiday differentials and discretionary bonuses that someone gets in a particular week. But certainly if they worked a weekend and they're not scheduled to work that weekend and now they're working 50 hours that week, the regular rate of pay would include the straight pay for that time and those hours, but not necessarily if you would pay, say, people double time to come in on a Sunday or a weekend. Secondly, what is a work week? A work week is defined in the law, FLSA regulations, as any regular recurring period, consecutive period of 168 consecutive hour period or 7 consecutive 24-hour periods. Basically, any 7-day period that's consecutive that you choose. You as the employer can determine what a work week is for an employee. It's not, Monday at 9 a.m. to the following Monday at 8:59. It could be Wednesday at 2 p.m. or whatever. You can determine that. What you can't do is change the work week for an employee based on a way to avoid paying overtime in that period. You can change it, but it would need to be going forward and with appropriate notice and the like. And finally, hours worked. This includes all time that the employee is required to be on the employer's premises, on duty, or at a prescribed workplace. And it can include things like waiting time, on-call time, and the like. The rules on that are pretty specific and complex, but basically think of it as any time that the employee is engaged, if you will, to wait for work, even if they're not performing actual work, as opposed to waiting to be engaged to work. If the employee is doing anything that's benefiting the employer or is essentially on call to perform that work when the work becomes available, those hours are most always counted as work hours. So when you're computing overtime, you would determine how many hours worked. Oh, and also suffer and permit time. This is a term of art that comes from the statute that essentially means that you as an employer cannot sit idly by and allow someone to perform services for you, and then at the end of the day say, oh, well, that wasn't authorized work, that wasn't, we didn't know that person was doing it, or the like. If you're any way, shape, or form enjoying the benefit of the person's endeavors, you need to count those hours as work time, and if it kicks over the 40 hours, pay the appropriate premium for those hours, which in now for employees who are subject to overtime or entitled to overtime, that's an issue, obviously. A lot of people in that category are hourly workers, but it's now going to be more important when you move into potentially a significant category of employees who are not eligible or now who are entitled to overtime because their compensation is less than the threshold, who may, because of their job requirements or just their attitude, are I stay here till the job is done. If they're working more than 40 hours, they're going to be eligible for overtime. So the question becomes, how do you monitor that? It's going to be important for supervisors and the like to be aware of individuals who are now entitled to overtime, how many hours they're working, and either have to be willing to pay it or have pretty good systems in place and policies and procedures to make sure that people do not work authorized or unauthorized overtime. And by the way, if they do work unauthorized overtime, it generally means that you can discipline them, but you can't dock their pay if they're still working for you. So keep that in mind. So when we're computing overtime, if necessary, we take the regular rate of pay for the week in which the overtime hours were worked. This is by work week again. And if it's more than 40 hours, well, first we divide the regular rate of pay for the week by 40. That gives you the hourly rate, if you will, and then multiply that by time and a half. So that for employees that you have that are salaried, who don't get paid on an hourly basis, but are now going to be eligible for overtime under the new rules regarding the threshold, you will need to be computing that regular rate of pay divided by 40, and multiply that resultant thing by 1.5 to get the rate of pay for the overtime hours. And we'll get to some more of the details of this as we talk more about the implications of this. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, there are key exceptions to the overtime rules under the Fair Labor Standards Act. The ones I think that are most relevant to you as employers are the executive, administrative, professional, to some extent computer employees perhaps, and highly compensated employees. And we'll talk now a little bit about detail about what they involve. Next slide, please. Okay, so the EAP, Executive, Administrative, Professional exemptions, have generally three components to it. First, these employees have to be performing duties that, as specified in the law, qualify them for this particular exemption or whatever exemption that you deem them to be eligible for. They vary. We'll talk a little bit about details, but so it's real important to look at your job descriptions and actually, more importantly, what the person is actually doing to see if what they do fits into the respective duties test. Now, interestingly enough, one of the rationales for that the Labor Department has given for the increasing the threshold for executive administrative employees is that, well, now you don't have to worry about what the people's duties are, because unless you pay them a certain amount of money, they're not going to be exempt anyway, which is probably true, but duties are still relevant, as we'll see later. Also, they have to be paid on a salary basis. Hourly employees, no matter what they do, with a couple exceptions here that we'll talk about briefly, are not exempt, period. So if you have someone who's the CEO of your organization and makes, it is paid by the hour as opposed to on a salary basis, they're not going to be eligible for an exemption, period, no matter what their duties are. And then finally, the salary basis, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, has to be at a certain amount. And this is where the new rule applies. This is really where the bite of the rule comes into place, the new threshold. So what I said before is really background to how this is going to affect you. Next slide, please. So executive employees, again, the duties test, they must have a primary duty of managing the enterprise or a recognized department or subdivision of the enterprise, customarily and regularly direct work of 2 or more other full-time employees or full-time employee equivalents. So if you had 4 half-time employees that they customarily direct, that would qualify for the 2 or more full-time employees, assuming I did my math right there, and has authority to hire or fire or determine other conditions of employment, or even if they don't have direct authority to hire and fire, their recommendations are given particular weight by those who do have that authority. For example, a department head may not have direct authority to hire or fire everybody in their department, but their recommendations are taken into account by the CEO or whoever does have that authority. That would fit that third prong. And they basically, you have to have, these are not optional, these are things that have to be there. So doing just one is not sufficient, one of these categories. Next slide, please. Administrative employees are, again, all these employees are people who we typically call white-collar employees. Note that it doesn't matter how they dress or how they show up to work. And they're not in the trenches somewhere with a hammer and work clothes. White-collar is a shorthand phrase for the kinds of people who typically perform these duties, but really you have to look at the duties. So administrative employee who is arguably exempt from the FLSA overtime rules, someone who performs office or non-manual work, this is our white-collar piece, directly related to the management or general operations of the employer or their customers, or in other words, makes the trains run on time, or does scheduling or that kind of thing. And their primary, this goes to making the operation run as opposed to providing services to individuals. And then finally, or secondly, their primary duty has to include the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to significant matters. There's no particular definition of significant matters. That is obviously a facts and circumstances test depending on your particular, what your organization does, but based on industry standards and the like. Next slide, please. Finally, there's an exemption for professionals or learned professionals. This would cover physicians, RNs, registered nurses generally, but the primary duty must involve the performance of duties that require, in order for you to perform the job in the first place, some sort of knowledge of an advanced type, primarily intellectual in character, consisting of exercise of discretion and judgment in a recognized field of science or learning, and acquired through a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. Generally, we're talking about some sort of degree or certainly a rigid certification process. I might add that another category that fits in here are teachers, provided that they're actually working in an recognized educational institution. So I would, if you're claiming that someone is exempt because they're a teacher, because they have background, et cetera, like we said here, you would want to make sure that whatever part of your organization or facility is that they're working in it has some sort of a recognition as an educational establishment, not just that they're using their teaching skills to help your clients out. And of course, there are many recognized schools for individuals, children, and the like that have health issues or behavioral issues that certainly would fit into that, but you want to make sure that they, that meets that test. And finally, physicians and teachers, as I might point out as well, and residents uniquely are not subject to the salary basis test. In other words, they don't have to be paid on a salary. They can be paid on some sort of piece rate, if you will, or encounter rate, or session rate, which providers are sometimes paid X dollars for being available for 4 or 5 hours. Next slide, please. And then there's a category of computer professionals. I put this in just to try to be a little thorough. I'm not sure if this is very relevant to anybody who's not Microsoft, because it does not cover the guy who comes into your office to plug in the computer, or to say, well, just try rebooting it if it doesn't work, or try unplugging it. It requires a lot more professional work in the computer field, typically in designing, documenting, testing systems, software, and that sort of thing. Now, if you have somebody who actually does that, you may possibly qualify for that, but I just wouldn't rely on it too much. And then next slide, please. Finally, there's a category of individuals called highly compensated employees. Currently, this covers anyone who earns whose compensation is at least $100,000 per year. Notice it's current because this is one of the things that changes under the new threshold. Have to perform non-manual work. So if you have a really high-paid building maintenance person who, and God knows some of them can be certainly worth that, they're not going to qualify. And in addition to performing non-manual work, they have to perform any one or more of the duties that we specified before for any of the executive, administrative, or professional exemptions, i.e. some sort of discretion, supervising. You can sort of pick and choose among those categories and make sure, as long as they do one of those or more and are paid now more than $100,000, they're going to qualify for an exemption. Next slide, please. Salary basis. Remember we talked about they have duties and they have a salary basis. So the salary basis is people who get paid a predetermined amount weekly or less frequently, for, meaning you get paid monthly or bi-weekly, however you get paid. It doesn't have to be weekly, for all or part of for all or part of their compensation for the work performed. So your salary is, $50,000 a year, and you have a job description, and that doesn't vary. That's what you get paid bi-weekly or weekly, however your pay period is. The amount cannot vary based on the quantity or quality of work performed, and we can get into this if there's questions later, but basically this means, it has to do with the so-called docking rules, which essentially is you can't withhold salaried employees' pay for not showing up to work for 4 hours in the morning, they were late for work, that sort of thing. You can certainly discipline people for that, but the problem with doing that, you dock somebody for being late, for example, or taking an unauthorized time off for sick pay or something like that, is that you run the risk of turning them into a hourly employee and kicking them into the overtime compensation area. Now, some of these issues, as we said before, may go away because the threshold is going up, and that's the third prong of the salary basis, which is be paid at the minimum compensation level. Next slide, please. So that, after long last and interruptions and audio problems, is really the meat of what we're talking about here. But I think you'll see it's important to understand what the basic rules are, because unless your plan is to now raise everybody up to the minimum threshold employment compensation salary basis, you're going to have a lot of people who were not eligible for overtime before but are now. So beginning December 1st, the salary basis, meaning if you're paying a salary, they have to earn a minimum salary of at least $913 per week, or $47,476 annually, as compared to the current amount, which is $455 and $23,660. So as you can see, it's more than doubled. Now, I think it's interesting to know that how the DOL got this. They determined this. First they took the lowest wage, based by census tract and census areas. They took the area of the country which has the lowest wages generally, which happens to be the South. And then this is set at 40% of that amount. So if you are actually in a really high wage area, New York City, San Francisco, or whatever, this may not have that much of an effect on you. It's hard to say. I think there's millions of people that the DOL says will now be covered for overtime that weren't before, but whether you're in that category or not is obviously depends a lot on what the prevailing wages are in your area and what you're paying now to get your qualified people. The highly compensated employee category goes from $100,000 to $134,004 annually. I'm intrigued by the $4 at the end. I guess if you pay only $134,000 even, you don't qualify, but that's what it's going to be beginning December 1st. For both of these categories, for not just for the highly compensated employee, but for anyone who gets paid on a salary basis, you may count regular bonuses, non-discretionary incentive compensation, which could be things like, I don't know, whatever you incentivize people to do, number of patients seen, reductions in costs, whatever. As long as it's non-discretionary, meaning that there's a formula out there that if the person meets those standards, they get the bonus or the incentive pay. And as long as you do that on a quarterly basis, then those bonuses can count up to 10% of the compensation that counts towards the minimum employment, the minimum salary levels to be eligible for overtime. The idea is that you didn't want to disincentive people from still providing incentives and bonuses and the like, but you can only count up to 10%, and it's got to be done quarterly. These minimums under the current regulations, note that regulations change, laws change. There was some thought of some lawsuits being filed to stop this. I haven't actually seen any evidence of that yet, but it's estimated based on trends to go, first of all, this amount's going to adjust every 3 years automatically from now on. The previous last adjustment before this was in 2004, which we got to 455, and before that, back in the early 2000s, it was like 200 something. So as you can see, they did a fairly bad job of keeping that amount updated over time, and so there's a big hit from the last 12 years. But in any event, with the next adjustment being in January of 2020, which is in the regs now, it's estimated, and that's why I highlight, to go to $984 a week, or $51,168 annually, or to $147,524 for your highly compensated employees. The other thing that, in addition to paying more money to avoid potential overtime issues, is that for people under this threshold, and even for people who are salaried, but now they're subject to overtime, there's record-keeping obligations, meaning that you need to track hours, which may not be an easy thing to do with a group of employees who are not used to doing that. And there's many techniques that people have used. We can maybe talk a little bit about them later, in terms of getting a timesheet for every hour they spent, or an exception timesheet, which is, I worked my 40 hours this week, but here's the exception, that kind of thing. But I don't think you should underestimate the potential in terms of your internal culture in getting people to do this. I mean, I work at a law firm where everybody's hours a day is regulated in tenths of hours, and it ain't easy to get people to keep adequate time here when that's where the revenue comes from. If you're not billing on an hourly basis, it may not be that easy to get people to do. There is a kind of a strange additional exception that I'm just going to mention because it might affect someone out here. There's an exception. It's really not an exception as much as an enforcement delay for group homes that have 15 or more beds that are funded through Medicaid, in which case you have additional time to comply with the rules for people working in that facility. Next slide, please. So now you've got the new threshold. What do you do? Well, I mean, and these are just options. These are not recommendations, because everyone is going to have to do, look at your own workforce, look what your budget can stand, look what you know, what your funding is looking like, and I can decide how to deal with this. But certainly one option, and these aren't in any order of preference, it's just that they came to mind when I put them on the slides, is okay, pay the overtime. Again, that all of this is going to, for these people who are not entitled to overtime, require record keeping and keeping track of time. Keep in mind, as I mentioned before, no suffer, permit time, meaning that if you had an employee who, you know, was salaried before, well, still is salaried, but was not entitled to overtime, and, you know, someone who, you know, comes in early and stays late, and because they feel like they're doing the job and they don't really care that they're not getting paid for it, you have to care now. You can't let them sit there and work till 8 o'clock at night if their shift or their time period is supposed to be over at 5, and not count that time as work time. It keys into the last point I made there, which is overtime pay is not waivable, meaning that you and the employee cannot decide, well, okay, I'm just going to waive we're not going to pay you this. It's just the employee. This is a public policy issue, if you will, from the government's perspective, and so neither the employee, well, the employer certainly can't waive it, but the employee can't. And even if you could, in my experience, what happens is that this all works fine and dandy until there's a falling out between you and the employee, and suddenly all this time that everybody sort of agreed to would not be paid at overtime becomes due and owing, because they're not feeling great towards you anymore, so they go to the wage and hour people, and suddenly you have a huge potential overtime bill plus all the penalties that go on top of it. So it's just not a good idea to not follow these rules as explicitly as possible. Remember, you can't average time over a pay period. So if you have a biweekly pay period and somebody works 44 hours in week 1 and 36 hours in week 2, they are eligible for 4 hours of overtime for week 1. Because you can't average it over the pay period. If people work, you know, under FLSA rules, you can work, if your regular work day is, you know, 9 to 5, and you work 10 hours Monday and Tuesday, you can not work, make that up by not working 2 hours, those 4 hours later in the week, and you still end up with the 40 hours in the week. But you can't average over, if you're really entitled to overtime based on more than 40 hours worked in that week, you got to pay for it. Again, for salaried people, you can't reduce pay or dock pay for poor performance or partial day absences. If they're absent for, you know, a day or more, you don't have to pay them for that. But the risk there is that you turn people into hourly employees if they're otherwise eligible for overtime. Next slide, please. So another option would be to reduce the regular scheduled work hours. This is assumed that you have somebody who regularly works now 50 hours, let's say, just for the sake of argument, but they were salaried and they were exempt under the old income level, and that was the deal. You know, they agreed to that their work week would be 50 hours, and they were happy with the salary. The only way you can avoid paying the overtime hours would be to reduce their work schedule so that they only work 40 hours. Or you could reduce their base pay and still work 50 hours, but have it, you know, net out so that you're not paying them more than you were paying them for their 50 hours before, including the time and a half for the extra 10 hours. Another option, which I didn't add because it's implicit in this, is that you can, for your overtime hours, you reduce hours of people who make sure they only work 40 hours, and then for the additional work that needs to be done that somebody was doing by working 50 hours a week, again, these are all very rough numbers, you hire part-time people to fill that gap. And that could work out financially as a cost savings. And frankly, if you look back at the policy statements behind FLSA in the first place, one of the reasons for requiring minimum wage and overtime for over 40 hours was that they thought that this would encourage employers to hire more part-time people, or at least more people, so that people weren't working overtime, and that way it would increase employment. So there's that policy issue behind the Fair Labor Standards Act as well. And again, you can raise the pay to above the overtime threshold. But the reason I went through the whole part of the early part of the presentation is that make sure, if you're going to do that, that the employee otherwise qualifies for one of the exemptions under the duties test, whichever one might be apt to them, because there's no particular advantage if you're trying to avoid overtime by raising them to that amount and then finding out that they're really not exempt in the first place because their duties don't qualify them under the rule. Next slide, please. So things that it does not require. It doesn't require you to convert salaried employees to hourly. I see that a lot where people say, oh, now we have to pay everybody on an hourly basis. Not true. What you have to do is pay people who have a salary who do not have a compensation above that threshold amount that otherwise qualify for an exemption overtime based on an hourly rate. That's true, but not that all their work is paid as an hourly basis. By the way, you could convert everybody to hourly as well. Then they wouldn't be exempt at all, and then you might actually avoid worrying about whether they are exempt under some of the duties tests or not, but then you're sort of back where you started by having to pay overtime for the time and a half. And I'm not a organizational culture person or a management consultant type at all, but I've read people who say that this may be that some people feel that they're being salaried is a status symbol, and that turning them into an hourly employee may have detrimental benefits in terms of morale and like. I don't know if that's true or not, but just throwing that out. It may require modifications to non-payroll employee benefits. Now, when I say may, there's nothing in the rule that addresses compensation, non-compensation benefits at all. In fact, the FLSA is entirely silent on any of the things that we typically think are important, if not necessary, to attract employees. Paid leave, sick leave, health care insurance, other kinds of benefits that come with that. None of that stuff is required under FLSA at all. But obviously, this can affect it. The threshold, if to the extent it changes how you deal with employees, could affect your compensation, your non-compensation benefits. Simply put, there's only so much money to go around. So does it go into salary and overtime? Does it go into benefits? That is a question that all of you need to think about and address how, in terms of these requirements and the potential for having to pay overtime, you deal with your budget constraints, because no one has a totally unlimited budget. The other way it could affect it, and is that I have seen employers define eligibility for things like vacation leave or other sorts of things like that that aren't necessarily that aren't insurance benefits or health care benefits, which are pretty rigidly regulated under the tax laws, to define those in terms of whether someone's an exempt employee or a non-exempt employee. frankly, I personally think that's not a really good way to do it. If you want to, maybe you could do it based on terms of tenure or job category or something like that, but simply doing things like vacation or other non-compensatory benefits tied to whether a person's an exempt employee or not an exempt employee could have a huge effect here if suddenly a whole bunch of people no longer become are no longer exempt. And then what do you do about your benefit plans? I mean, so I think that needs to be looked at in terms of policies and how you define those. That's why it's a big may. Next, oh, and then finally, importantly, none of this, just to reiterate, none of the rules here have anything to do with the duties test that we went through. Have the next slide, please. Yeah, the duties have pretty much have not changed. The regulation is actually pretty simple. It's fairly short. It just talks about these pay thresholds and the duties test and these other requirements, including how what is determined to be a salary basis pay system that has not changed. Can you just advance the slide, please? Okay, so things not to do. So do not try to get clever and now classify everybody who works for you or a significant number of people who work for you or the people who might be eligible for overtime as independent contractors as opposed to employees. Remember, FLSA only applies to people who are employees. So turning someone into an independent contractor might at first blush seem to be a clever way to get around this. The IRS and probably the FLSA people would not take kindly to that because there are pretty clear tests of who is an employee and who's an independent contractor. And somebody who is an employee on Friday and comes back to work on Monday doing essentially the same thing, except now they're paid on an independent contract basis as opposed to a salary basis, is not going to be persuasive with the IRS, which is interested in this because of withholding and employment tax issues, or certainly the FLSA people because they will say, look, this is just a scam to get around it. Now, this is not to say that you may want to reclassify categories of jobs and the like in a fashion that would lend itself well to an independent contractor relationship, but you have to look very carefully at that. And finally, most importantly, and one of the reasons we're doing this in August, although it is clearly not too early, and maybe late in some cases, is to don't wait till November to figure out what and how you're going to deal with potentially significant new overtime obligations for a substantial number of your workforce. So finally, final slide. There is no one best way to handle this. I spelled out a few options. It might be a combination of those for each of you or any of you. And in fact, you may need to deal with how you're going to handle the threshold by an employee basis in terms of whether you raise salary, in terms of whether you monitor hours, that sort of thing. So with that, and I think we're pretty much on schedule if we assume that we lost 20 minutes or so on when people couldn't hear it. So at this point, I'm happy to address questions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mike. That was a great presentation. So yeah, I just wanted to check in history box. Are you okay to stay on for a few more minutes and answer some questions?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So we've gotten many questions. So I've broken them down into some major things. So can you elaborate on when you were first talking about first starting the presentation? You were talking about billable versus non-billable hours, supervisors on-call time, things like that. Can you elaborate more on that? What, for a supervisor who is on call 24/7, how should an employer calculate that time? Is that total time worked? How does those hours count, billable, non-billable?
Well, billable and not billable is two different things, and whether you can bill it to some vendor or something is a different time. But I hate to say this because this is the classic, it depends, but If you're on call and you're on the employer's premises, say, because you're there, but let's say this may not fit exactly with this group, but an emergency worker who was on call to go out in an ambulance or something, but there's no ambulance call. You got to be paid for that. You're on call to go and do the work. In most cases, but this is something that you need to look at, because facts determine a lot here. If someone who's on call at home, meaning they are not, they're waiting for the buzzer to ring, or I guess it's not a buzzer anymore, it's your cell phone or something to ring, and can be, or can call in and say, okay, I can be reached at, I'm going to dinner, but I can be reached at XYZ restaurant, is probably not working. And I say probably because you have to look specifically at what constrictions you put on someone. And also questions like, you are on call, but what is the response time? I mean, if on call means I have to be able to respond to whatever I'm on a call for in 20 minutes, that would put a much bigger restriction on something that I have to be on call and hopefully call back this client or this patient sometime before the night is over. So that's the basic, basic rules, but it's real important to look exactly what you're requiring for that employee.
Great, thank you. One of the other major points during your presentation, we got a lot of questions, was about defining the work week in terms of hours. A lot of our attendees here don't all adhere to the 40-hour work week. So can you explain a little bit about what happens when your work week is 32, 33, 37 and a half hours?
Okay, great. So this has to be related, first of all, to the FLSA definition of work week. So that is the 7-day, 24-hour consecutive hour period. So within that work week, however you define it, if you work, and including these things like suffer permit or on call, more than 40 hours, then that's when the 40-plus hours are when overtime kicks in. If you only work 32 hours, say, for example, because that's your regular scheduled period, that's 32 hours. Now, if your regular scheduled period is 32 hours, but someday you work an extra 4 hours for whatever reason, now you're up to 36, that's not going to kick in Fair Labor Standards Act FLSA overtime. It might in some jurisdictions that have 7-day work weeks, or 7-hour work days rather. I guess the 32 wouldn't even be then, but some jurisdictions have fewer than 40 hours of work weeks before they require overtime. But in a normal circumstance, just talking about FLSA, unless you work more than 40 hours, there's no overtime paid. Now, whether or not you have to pay the person for that, well, but then let me back up a sentence. So if you're a salaried employee and your work week is 40 hours and you only work 32, then that gets into the question of whether you can dock the pay and whether the pay was, generally you don't have to pay people for time they didn't work. So you wouldn't have to pay them for that, but you would not be close to the FLSA threshold for overtime either. And I hope I made that clear, but the point is that only actual hours worked over 40 kick in the FLSA overtime rules in a work week defined as that 168 hour consecutive period of time. Hope that's helpful.
It looks as though it is, reading the feedback.
Okay. Okay.
The next bulk of questions came along with your Learn Professional slide, talking about specific certifications and licensures. Can you speak more on who does and does not qualify as a learning professional, or do you know of a resource where our attendees could find a detailed list?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I have it here in front of me if I can find it. The Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, which is accessible on the internet, has innumerable fact sheets and other information on FLSA issues. And there's fact sheets on just about everything you can think of, including that issue. And if I could find it in front of me, I would tell you. But the key thing, and I think the questioner picked up on it, is that, for example, I gave an example of registered nurses, but in some cases, LPNs, licensed professional nurses, might qualify as well. But there's very specific requirements for those various other professionals other than physicians and lawyers, I might say. And I didn't go into detail because it's really not part of the substance here, but it's a great question, and that information certainly is available at the on a DOL website. But it's a real the key thing to know is just assume just because they got an advanced degree of some sort from somebody after high school or after a four-year college even doesn't necessarily mean that they are eligible. And oh, by the way, they also have to be doing, I think I mentioned this, but in case I didn't, you have to be working in that profession. So if you've got, like if I would normally qualify as because I have a law degree and et cetera, et cetera. One could argue whether it's a decent profession or whether how advanced a degree it is, but nevertheless, the FLSA people would say that I'm exempt. But if I happen to, take a job working at the front desk of a facility because I want to do that, I'm not practicing in that area. So that time I wouldn't qualify for the professional. Now, that does not mean that, we've all had this circumstance where, certainly I have, where I'm starting to hope we don't hear the siren outside, where there's a crisis and we have to get this thing out, and so everybody's got to Xerox stuff and work at the Xerox machine or do stuff that would otherwise not be professional work. A little bit of time doing that is not going to kick somebody out of that professional category. But the primary duties, the primary job, has to be something within the realm of what that professional qualification is. The example I think I gave was teachers. I mean, if it needs to be in a recognized educational institution, certainly many of your members may have people who have teaching degrees and the like, but unless they're actually exercising that professional competence in a recognized educational setting, that's not going to qualify them for the admin or for the professional exemption. So it's both. It's for some of the especially in the healthcare area, some of the things that are physicians' assistants, LPNs, that sort of thing. You have to really look carefully at what the specific requirements are.
Great. During your discussion, you mentioned that employers cannot dock the pay for partial days worked by salaried employees.
Right.
What can employers do? Can you require them to use accrued time for that?
You can, yes, you can say, okay, you've just used your, you had X hours of paid time off. It now has been reduced to, whatever it is minus that. Yeah, you can do that. Again, I'm not saying that you can't take action. I mean, people need to be doing the job, and if they're out not doing the job for reasons that are not otherwise protected, like family medical leave and that sort of thing, or ADA, you can certainly take disciplinary action. You just run the risk of turning them into a salaried employee if you dock their pay. And as long as we're talking about this, probably the next question, or the question typically follows this, well, what about comp time, compensatory time? Compensatory time is, except for specific provisions in the law for public employees, meaning state or local government employees, which I'm not going to get into. We can get into, well, we're not going to get into, that have a permission to do that. You can't avoid overtime by saying, okay, I'm not going to pay you the overtime, but I'm going to give you compensatory time off in the future. Because the other risk there too is that you, when you start counting people's hours like this, remember the whole notion of salary basis is to be paid a fixed amount for a agreed upon scope of services, if you will. And if you start getting down into, well, you were this hour and that hour, the like. Now I'm now talking again about employees who are otherwise eligible for the exemption. You sort of run the risk, well, it's not really a salary basis anymore. We're really looking at you as an hourly employee. Now you certainly can reward people for extraordinary work, for working harder. You can give them a bonus. You can maybe add some time to their otherwise accrued PTO time, paid time off, but you can't, sort of substitute if they're for the overtime pay that they're otherwise entitled to, if they are entitled to it, by giving them time off. I mean, that's been an issue that has percolated in Congress at time to time because, frankly, a lot of people nowadays would rather have the flexibility in their schedule and get extra time off in some fashion than in getting the extra dough that comes with overtime. But that's not been legislated yet anywhere except in the for people who work for state and local governments.
Okay, so expanding on that, actually, what for those financial bonuses for people who have an incentive system within their performance incentive system tied to financial income, how does if that is are those financial incentives and bonuses can they be calculated into the overall annual pay of whether or not that meets the threshold for overtime?
They can be if, number one, they are non-discretionary. In other words, I don't know, if it's a performance base that can be measured by objective standards, whether that be additional time spent or additional encounters or however you do it, and it has to be calculated at least quarterly, awarded at least quarterly, and it can only count up to 10%. That amount cannot be more than, or only count for 10% of what the threshold would otherwise be. So, you would, if it's, you could deduct it up to 10% of the threshold amount is what I guess I'm trying to say. So if it's $900 a month, less than $90 a week, rather, would up to that you could count as the towards the $900 a week.
Getting back to some of the on-call, but this is related to travel time. For people who travel a lot for work, getting to and from clients, in and around, for rural areas that they're traveling to a client site, is all of that calculable in work time?
So the question is, my job is to go to some site A to site B to site C to see clients. Yes, that is counted as work time. If it's if it's like out of town on a one-time basis, it may not be. I'm looking for, there's a specific fact sheet on this. I mentioned the various fact sheets, and there is one on that. It's, for those of your interest, it's fact sheet number 22 under the Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor. It talks about hours worked, and So the basic rules, it says that home to work travel isn't compensated. That's part of the, getting to work. Travel that is all in a day's work, meaning time spent by an employee in travel activities such as travel from job site to job site during the workday is work time and must be counted as hours worked. And then the thing in the middle is that somebody is regular works a fixed location in one city, but you get to a special one-day assignment to another city and come back home the same day. The travel time is counted as well. But you can then but then you can offset the amount of time. In other words, if I usually go from home to my office here in the District of Columbia, I can't charge that. If today they say, oh, today we want you to go to Baltimore, and again, this is assuming that then I could count my time from home to Baltimore as hours worked minus the time that I would normally spend going from here to DC. For those of you who are not out of the area, Baltimore is like 40 miles away. So what you would do is you could count the time on that one-day special assignment going to Baltimore, but then you deduct from that time that I would normally be coming to the regular office. On the other hand, if my job is to go to 4 different locations in my immediate area here on a daily basis or as an assigned basis, I'm the IT person who is not exempt otherwise, or even if they are exempt, my job is to go out there, then that would be, when called, that would count as work time, the travel time involved.
So for people who travel the country to either work at or participate in conferences, I know we have a lot of people that participate in conferences in our field.
Okay, so that's why you need, this is getting a tad beyond the scope here, but that's why another reason you should look at this thing, because conferences are different, and it depends on whether the time is done on a regular work day or not, and whether you've done any other work for the organization, and whether the conference is something that's required to do by you, or is it, that sort of thing. So I think that you look at the fact.
We'll definitely connect to make sure that all of our attendees have access to these fact sheets. We'll pull them for you. We'll send them out with the webinar recording.
Right.
Michael, those are the big bucket items. We definitely have some more specific questions, more targeted questions, and here at the National Council, we will be scouring through all of these comments and questions to get all of our attendees the answers that they need. So, Michael, unless you have any final closing thoughts?
No, I just think that, again, I think the most important thing is to, again, some of this may be a big, well, it probably is a big issue for everyone. How big it is going to depend a lot on obviously what your salary scales now are. But I guess for all of you who took the time to do this today, that's really a good thing to do, because it's now August 9th and December 1st is not so far away. And it's real important to determine what you're going to do. And I would strongly suggest that in the course of that, you look at your overtime policies, not just for the people that are now going to no longer be exempt, if there are any, but in general, because, first of all, it's going to cover those people, but also, sometimes these things slip through and we're not really following the rules as they are expected to be followed. So that's my final words of the day.
Thank you very much, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. We will do our best to get an edited recording out to you as soon as possible, as well as the slides, the fact sheets Michael was referencing, and answer as many questions as you can. If you have questions, please do contact National Council staff. We will work hard to get you the answers that you need. Thank you all very much, and have a great day.
Good day, all.